Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Some of you may wonder why I am standing here. Why is a white European male guy talking about peace in the Philippines? Well, it all began in 2004 with Ed Garcia, the guy Nikki mentioned yesterday, who taught many of us that building peace requires a marathon mentality. And he invited the University of Barcelona to the Philippines because he wanted increased international support to the peace talks with the communist insurgency that were ongoing with difficulties at that time. One thing led to another, and then we eventually met people like Sol Santos, Miriam Coronel, Joby Reyes, Inday Santiago, and so many others with whom we eventually developed partnership relations, carefully crafted to be horizontal, with an insider-outsider approach. What I'm sharing with you today is an outsider-insider perspective on what we all can learn in the international community from peace-building efforts in the Philippines. Key dates for those fellow externals like myself: 1521, a sailor called Magellan arrives in these islands kind of by coincidence, and he gives them the name of the Spanish king Philip II. So the name is a colonial heritage from Spanish times. 300 years later, after a bloody war, Philippines gains independence from the Spaniards, only to be occupied by the Americans, who stay on until the Second World War, and finally Philippines gains its freedom. 1968, two armed conflicts begin. One communist insurgency that's still ongoing, and in the southern island of Mindanao, this one, Muslim insurgency seeking for self-determination of the Muslim minority in the Philippines. From this time, the end of the 20th century, Philippine legacies for peace building internationally are essentially the people's power revolutions. We heard them in the previous workshop. The recent developments in Sri Lanka were inspired, like so many others, by social movements who were able to get rid non-violently of the dictatorship in 1986 and a corrupt regime in 2001. Let's now zoom into this very specific context of Mindanao. Here's a history, and this is why I gave you the key dates before. Spain colonized the Philippines except the island of Mindanao, where, oh surprise for the Christian colonizer, there was already Muslim sultanates established long before Christianity had arrived. Now, they were never fully conquered by the Spanish. It wasn't until the Americans came that they started settling, and they started distributing land to Christian settlers from elsewhere in the Philippines, which led to the minoritization of the Muslim population in their own homeland through policies initially promoted by the American colonizers and later by the newly independent regime. This is now more or less where the Muslim minority are still a majority in the context of the Philippines. In this context, Moro National Liberation Front began a struggle for independence in 1968. They reached a peace agreement in 1996, but had a splinter group. From the Moro National Liberation Front became the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. You always have splinter groups when there's a peace agreement. And they continued their own struggle. Now we go into the analytical part of this. Adaptive approach. This was a 17-year-long peace negotiation. 17 years of negotiation, on-off. There was a ceasefire holding for most of the time with three major crises in 2000, 2003, and 2008. After each crisis, both parties learned from mistakes from the previous efforts and created or sophisticated the peace support infrastructure. So, after having direct talks in the Philippines in 2001, they asked Malaysia to facilitate talks in Malaysia. After the 2003 break, they created a ceasefire monitoring mechanism, the International Monitoring Team. Interestingly, civil society, by their own initiative, without any formal mechanism, created a civil society monitoring Bantai ceasefire. After the 2008 crisis, the parties sophisticated the ceasefire mechanism, adding 2 more countries to the IMT, and then created a civilian protection component where they invited NGOs to be part of the formal monitoring mechanism. NGOs, 3 of them being Filipino, 1 of them being International Nonviolent Peace Force. And then they created something completely new, the International Contact Group. This was a mechanism by which 4 countries and 4 NGOs were invited to sit at the talks, observe, and advise. And at that time, I was working with Conciliation Resources and became the representative of CR in this structure. What's the pattern we can see in these developments over the years? This is a context where crises became opportunities for learning and for improvement. This is a context where civil society organizations played a fundamental role in pushing peace process forward, especially in times of crisis. And in terms of power dynamics, which is something we discussed yesterday at the opening, there still is significant international support, but always very careful to respect the local ownership. Like somebody said yesterday, internationals are welcome, but Filipinos are in the driver's seat. Big players, US, UN, you won't see them. They are largely playing a secondary role. Quick dive into the International Contact Group. This is when we visited the camp of the More Islamic Liberation Front. Here you see the civilian component of this ICG, the 4 NGOs. Mr. Steve Rood, Director of the Asia Foundation, David Gorman, Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, Emma Leslie, and myself from Conciliation Resources, and Dr. Marcus from Muhammadiyah, an Indonesian peace-building organization, an Indonesian NGO, not peace-building NGO. What did the ICG contribute? Many, if not most, peace negotiations in the world have some sort of contact groups, groups of friends, quartets, or other structures to organize. This was the first ever hybrid mechanism where NGOs were invited together with diplomats to work. This way, we were able to balance the expectations. So the weaker part, the rebels, always want big players, UN, to be around. The governments are always worried about internationals messing around. The agreement, the consensus, let's have both governments, not very big, and NGOs. With that mandate, what we achieved, I would say, greater international commitment and attention to the peace process, and a very clear complementarity. Diplomats can do things NGOs cannot do, leverage on policymakers. NGOs, especially peace-building NGOs, can do things diplomats have no clue about. Dialogue, approaching people in different contexts. Of course, we had a number of challenges we can look into later. But all in all, the story of the peace process in Mindanao is, I would say, a story of significant international success. Did lead to the signing of a peace agreement, the first ever peace agreement in the world where a woman, Miriam Coronel, was leading one of the parties to the talks. And what we can learn, this is the final slide from the hopes. This was a protracted peace and armed conflict from 1968. Protracted armed conflicts, even if they've gone on for decades and seem extremely complex, they can be solved, more or less at the same time as they were having talks in Colombia, and a similar process was happening. Now, we can today learn from the developments in the Philippines, but Philippines also looked at previous exercises. All peace processes look at what happened before them elsewhere in the world, and then end up innovating and teaching for those that come after. I skipped this one. We do know that the handshake moment, like signing a peace agreement, does not bring peace. And we have heard these days about the challenges that still face Mindanao 10 years after the signing of the peace agreement. But so that is giving us idea that the relevance of a peace agreement as a milestone, as creating hope for a better future, and of course so much more work to be done. The legacy of this peace process globally is that civil society organizations have played and can play a fundamental role in monitoring ceasefires. So the Colombians looked at the Philippines to learn about this experience, among many others. Women's agency and civil society agency in the Philippines is something the rest of the world keeps looking at constantly. And two questions open I leave here. Hybrid contact groups. We honestly thought that would set a precedent for others to follow. It didn't happen. And positive developments in the Philippines, in Mindanao, on the Mindanao peace process, did not replicate on the communist insurgency, which is still going on and still facing major challenges. Thank you.